Welcome to Better Leaders, the podcast, where we surface good leadership and smart management in media and beyond. Today, I'm talking to Hillary Frey, editor-in-chief of Slate. My name is Anita Zilina, and I'm your host. Welcome to Better Leaders. Hillary, I'm so happy to have you here in my podcast here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk a little bit about leadership, management, transforming media organizations, and media careers and all of that. And you have plenty of experience to share with our listeners about all these topics. You have a still relatively new role as editor-in-chief at Slate. How long have you been there?
I think it's about 9 months now, almost a year.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
We're just going to say it's the 9-month instead of the 90-day kind of little review thingy. So maybe let's start with that. Let's start with the big topics. 9 months as the editor-in-chief of Slate. How did you approach those first few months in a new role as a manager, as a leader?
So when I was interviewing at Slate, it was really clear to me what the needs were that aligned with my particular interests at this moment in my career. So I knew going in that the first thing I needed to do was try and listen to everyone on staff. And I also I started in June, and I knew I'd be taking the first 2 months of July off for a pre-planned holiday. So I set this pretty ambitious goal of spending my first month doing one-on-one meetings with everybody in my organization. That was about 45 people, really just to hear their story about Slate. A lot of people have been there their whole career or for many, many years. They've had many jobs. They've grown in different ways. And I wanted to kind of understand the current state of the organization through the people and their experiences learning and growing at Slate and kind of what their ambitions were or would be going forward. And then from those, my plan was to spend, after I got back from my holiday, sort of time formulating a hiring plan and a staffing theory, I would say. So it was important for me to listen to everybody to really understand where there were needs in the organization. So for example, our audience development team, everybody was doing 3 jobs. They spent part of the day on the homepage, part of the day doing social, part of the day doing something else. And I just thought, this is not a recipe for success for anybody. So just kind of identifying those opportunities, also seeing overall that we did not have a lot of entry-level editorial reporting and writing roles. That was something I want to create more of a pipeline for growth at Slate. So things like that. Layered on top of that I thought I would also sort of do through the first couple months was listen to people about management in the sense that this Slate's been around since 1997, has a really strong identity out there in the world, I think. So there wasn't a crisis with who are we or what do we do in my mind. Certainly wasn't a crisis. You can always ask questions about that and hone that. But there had been very strong editorial leadership that is so often, it's so common in our industry, just not a lot of rigor when it came to management.
Which is very common in the journalism industry, I'll say, right?
Common. And not a lot of operational sort of execution on the editorial side.
Yeah.
So, and that's where for me, that was the most exciting thing about on top of editing this amazing magazine, right? And being the sort of the editor in chief, which was great. And I love it. But there was so much opportunity to create processes that made people feel secure. So everything from, we're going to revamp the annual review process so that it's meaningful.
Yeah.
And be very intentional about that and tie it to a transparent raise and compensation increase request and promotion request process, and just start to make these things make sense and not box checking exercises, right? So one of the things I committed to, we got all of our 2022 reviews done by the end of February of this year. And I set the goal of, I will read all of them. I will read everyone's review because it has their goals in it for this year by the end of April. So that, they know this isn't just going into somebody's Google Drive somewhere. It's like, no, I want to hear first person. I've already heard a lot in person, but really get the full picture of where people think they are and where they want to go. So those were, and I have to say, a lot of that stuff is wrapping up now. And as I've said to, lots of folks, the low-hanging fruit has been picked. So now the issues are a lot thornier. They're more complicated, the things that we're starting to deal with. But I do think if my goal was in those first 6 to 9 months to gain the trust of the team, and doing that by demonstrating real interest in improving the structure around how people work, I think we've made a lot of improvements there.
And I mean, you're just at the beginning of the journey, right? 9 months is literally goes by like a blip for anyone who started in new organizations. 9 months as a new manager, getting to know the team, getting to know the organization, it just goes by so fast, right? So I think that's super interesting to hear. Now, Hillary, you just used a lot of words where that I'd say traditional newsroom person might react slightly allergic to some of them. Performance reviews, processes, structures, operational excellence. A lot of, might I say, very kind of grown-up management words that you don't hear that often in newsrooms. Can you talk a little bit about that? How has both at Slate, how has your focus on these elements that I find, truly interesting and important for organizational health, how has that been received? And also, where does that come from? What is your personal philosophy? Why do processes, operations, structures, and so forth play such an important role in management for you?
Yeah, well, to the point of how it has been received, when I listened to folks when I first got to Slate, there was just a great hunger for management. We're a unionized newsroom, so only a handful of us are not in the union. A lot of our managers are in the union. And I had folks in the union who are managers saying, can we please have management training? And it was like music to my ears, because often, in these U.S. labor relations that can happen in newsrooms, you get a real oppositional management versus the newsroom dynamic. And Slate, because of the way the union is organized and the size of our newsroom, it's a very collaborative experience, or it has been so far. So I don't think I would have been quite so ambitious out of the gate with these things if I hadn't heard from people that they were ready for it. They were ready for somebody to come in and who was invested in transparency, in communicating about the business, in creating a clear hiring plan, for being able to explain why, right? It's not just going after stars or big writers. So it's been received really well, and no downsides at this point. Like I said, everybody got their reviews in on time. And to that, I was not always this way. I came up in magazines and digital and print. And while one of my earliest jobs was as a managing editor, so I've always been interested in the process and how you make something. I'm not just a line editor or a story editor. I really came up through a management structure in that way. And I learned managing processes around print and distribution and things early on. And I worked in advertising too. So I have a business appreciation as well in my deep background. I think it was really at HuffPost where I was the executive editor for 3 years, after spending a year doing a special project there, that I worked with a really brilliant operations leader who was just so empathetic and passionate about this idea that process can make people understand the business and feel secure in their roles, that it really just transformed what I saw as part of my job, right? It's not all of my job. I lead workshops and postmortems and come up with special projects and all that stuff. But if you don't have the sort of building secure, those things, they just feel like ornaments that could like pop off, your facade. Yeah. So it was really by seeing how people responded when this is a granular thing, right? But a thing is when you encourage people to advocate for themselves, right? So this is around, we create a time of year where you can ask for a raise and a promotion. Create that space so that it's not always reactive. Oh, this person got a job offer, so we have to react, right? It rewards one kind of person or two kinds of people, but not the whole. So we want to create that space. And when we did this at HuffPost, it also required training managers on how to tell people that they aren't getting a raise or a promotion, or it's not as big as they wanted. And it's not easy, but I feel really passionately that we're giving people a skill set that if they continue to grow or become managers or more senior editorial leaders, these are all things that it's better to learn along the way than, be mid-career. Like, I've never had a difficult conversation in my life with anybody about their performance. So I think to me, all of this is about career development as well. And I was very convinced by that also through my own experience as developing as a leader at HuffPost with the aid of some really smart people who approached what a healthy newsroom looked like differently than I had before.
Yeah. So interesting, because the media industry in general, and we talked about that before, right? The media industry in general has this interesting skeptical approach, broadly speaking, to management development and leadership training and so forth, because often what we are still seeing, and I think it's getting less, but it's still there, is people being promoted because they are the best journalists. Well, surprise, surprise. At some time, if you want to climb up the ladder, if you want to earn more money, if you want to get a promotion, that means starting to lead people. Well, guess what? It's not always the best journalists who are the best leaders. It's not always the people writing or producing the best journalistic content who are, the most excited about smooth processes and fantastic feedback sessions and so forth. How do we tackle that? I mean, what is your personal perspective on not just Slate at this moment, but the broader media industry and the question of leadership and management?
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking, I'm the child of a salesperson. My dad worked for Xerox and ran sales of copiers in the 80s, and then ran small businesses until he retired on his own. And I worked in retail always through high school and college to support myself. And that's deep in my DNA, right? I wasn't a high school journalist. I mean, I wrote some for the college newspaper, but I've always seen myself as, I have that communication skill that you need when you're selling something. I don't feel like I'm out there selling Slate in the same way, but it meant that when I got a toehold in this industry and I started in advertising, that part of my personality was really important. And where I remember asking somebody when I was like 22 and I worked at this little magazine, Lingua Franca, I said, who has more power, writers or editors? And most people think early in their career, right, writers do because their byline is everywhere. And I was like, I don't think so. I think the editors have all the power. I'm not saying I'm power hungry psycho person, but like always being an editor, being behind the scenes was where I knew I was going to be. And some of that is that I don't have where my ego sits. I don't need to have I like to write, but I don't need to see my byline out there. Mm. And as I grew in my career, what really gave me joy was providing the support to the great journalists I work with to get their best or their funniest or their fastest or whatever work out there and advocate for them. Mm. And that, I just think that's where we should be looking for the leadership talent, because I think that there's something sort of, maybe I'm right or wrong, but in my experience, a lot of the great editorial leaders and some of the people I've really respected as coworkers, or who I've seen go off to other places, they derive the pleasure and the satisfaction from being removed, from the product that's out in the world, like being a little bit more behind the scenes. Now, not every editor-in-chief is like that, to your point, and they come up through different paths. But for me, it seems like a direct line to being able to have this approach to running a newsroom, to like also being the person who was selling dresses that somebody else looked beautiful in, and I'm not saying our executive editor at Slate, Susan Matthews, who's an incredible journalist, is also a great leader. I mean, she just has also a lot of conviction and fearlessness about decision making. So that's another thing. It's like finding, to me, that's just such a key element of being a strong leader, is being decisive and not being afraid to mess up. This is something at Slate, and I'm sorry, I'm being a little circular here. I don't know if I'm totally answering how we solve this in media, but I will say at Slate, part of the management I'm trying to tell people too is like, you've got to give people room as we're training them to mess up. So like, maybe they're not going to write the best headline on the story. Don't go in and just fix it. Like, give them the opportunity to fix it themselves and give the feedback, because you've got to train people to be comfortable to see that there's something that can be better or worse, or to just have a story fail. That's okay too. It's like, and then we talk about it afterwards. I believe in the postmortem exercise for this, as opposed to like gatekeeping. Some people would think leadership is like gatekeeping, right? Like, I'm going to sign off on everything before it goes out the door and make sure we all feel 100% great about it. I don't think that time allows for most of us to live that way. So, and
even if time allowed, right? The question is, what signal does that send to your team? What signal does it send to people who are kind of very, specifically in the beginning, very receptive to the signals you send, right? And if you want to micromanage every tiny last detail, and if every mistake leads to them like being immediately like corrected and not having the opportunity to correct things themselves and try something new, what signal does it send? Well, obviously it sends the signal that, you're better than them and you can do a better job. That is obviously not really going to lead to an empowered, independent, team of employees, right? So I do agree. So let's maybe stick with that, because I think that's a really interesting and intriguing part of that conversation. What are some of the qualities you think a leader in the broader media space needs to have these days? You mentioned being receptive for feedback, being able to give good feedback. You mentioned decisiveness and being able to make fast and good decisions. What else comes to mind?
Well, I think the thing that follows the making fast and good decisions, it's flexibility of also seeing that something you decided isn't working, right? So before I came to this conversation with you, I was talking to somebody at Slate who I had set down one path and then decided, I was like, no, we're not doing that. I want you just to own this thing over here because my priorities have shifted. And I want to give you something to own and win on. So do this. Let's leave that other thing out the door, and not being afraid to change your own mind. I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's really easy to set a plan and then say, well, this is the plan. But I think flexibility and constantly ripping up the plan is really, being open to that is really important.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think being empathetic is so important, and really understanding people as individuals. It's much easier in smaller organizations than big ones. You know, if you have 300 people, but training your managers to see people in their whole circumstance, their whole life. And that's not to say you should still have goals. The goals need to be met. The job needs to be done. But having the fuller picture around who somebody is can just make you a much more effective manager, right? And it takes a little time, and it's not, I would say also that now when you get older, it becomes a lot easier not to be part of the social fabric of your workplace in the same way that you might early in your career. And, you know, if you're a young manager, you're probably going to socialize with your team and all that stuff. But getting older, of course, I care what people think about me at Slate. But what I care that they think about me isn't, they don't all have to like me, though. I mean, I hope they do, you know, because you're like, I think I'm a likable person most of the time. But the important thing is that they see me following through on the things I promised, which were transparency and communication, just these things that they felt they were missing in the past, and really being on top of that, because they shouldn't have to ask for that. You know, I don't like, if I ask somebody, can you go do this? Let me know what happens. And then I don't hear anything. I really hate following up. Like, I hate it. I'm like, wait, what happened with this? Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you. I don't want people to feel that they have to bother me for the answers that I've promised them. So I think that also means everybody always talks about delegation, but it is going back to that not micromanaging. It's like, let people fly, let them learn from their mistakes, own the fact that that's your philosophy. But it's the only way, I think, in leadership, you've got to figure out how to stay out of the weeds. And a lot of people are really comfortable in the weeds. And I understand that. But really allowing yourself to have space around you so that you can continue to take in the whole picture, even if you're tackling individual problems along the way.
And I think that's such a fascinating aspect of the conversation, that kind of balance between control and freedom, and that kind of, you know, two far ends of the spectrum, like detachment and micromanagement. And I do think what's so interesting is that hybrid work and remote work, and the 2-something years of the pandemic that we all spent working from our bedrooms or kitchen tables, has kind of accelerated the importance of conversations around these topics. And what I'm seeing is that specifically younger generations, but not really, you know, it's not limited to younger generations, but it is, you know, stronger, I think, more dominant in younger generations. There is just this kind of strong push to work in a work environment that gives them that certain element of autonomy, that allows them that certain element of impact, that allows them to make mistakes, that allows them to kind of make their own mistakes, but while still being accountable, of course. Do you see that? I mean, do you see that kind of both, one, that generational element, that generational shift happen, but also how did you experience the pandemic in that sense? How did you experience hybrid or remote work kind of influencing those factors of leadership?
It's so interesting. I mean, at Slate, we all appreciate the flexibility of the hybrid work. There's an expectation people come in 1 or 2 days a week to our office in Brooklyn. And I go in every Wednesday, but I leave at 2 because I pick up my child from school. And we haven't even talked about modeling, but that's like a big piece of this too. But with Slate, this is a team that loves to be together. I have people, and they're all younger. I mean, I'm a good 15 years older than most people at Slate and in my leadership team even. And they like to come to the office because they're social creatures and they're young and they live with partners and they don't all want to be on top of each other all the time. So to me, I've really tried to embrace the balance aspect that's come out of the pandemic. So it's like trusting people to know what they need. If they need to come to the office every day, that's wonderful. But it doesn't mean everybody else needs to, but it does mean that I love that we have a physical space for people if they need that.
Yeah.
We have a lot of, I mean, when I think about the pandemic, I think about all the people like myself who had kids at home and things like that. This is the second time I've been with a staff where there are a lot of babies. Staff is younger, a lot of babies, a lot of sick kids, right? They're all going to daycare for the first time. And there are days when it's like, wow, it feels like everybody's out and we're not publishing anything. It happens. And people this week, 2 people in leadership are out the same days for pre-planned trips. And is it going to be, I'm not asking if it's going to be okay. As I said to one of the people who was like, I feel so guilty. I said, anybody could get hit by a bus tomorrow or have the flu or have a sick kid and not be able to come to work. We can't control these things. So I just think it's this say yes mindset to letting each person figure out, when do you need the time off? Unless there's some crazy reason that I don't even know what it would be. The whole leadership team can't be out at the same time, but nobody's going to do that. It's like, say yes, understand, that different people are working differently. But again, this is why feedback is so important. If something is going really sideways and you're like, where did this person go? I haven't seen them on Slack in 2 days and they aren't in the vacation calendar. Then it's like, hey, let's check in here, right? But 9 times out of 10, in my experience, not just at Slate, but at HuffPost too, there was usually a reason, right? Why, this happened or this happened. And I told this person and they didn't tell this person. It's like, it's a trust thing. And the other thing I've thought a lot about, and I've talked to folks about this too, that I think is a great thing that came out of the pandemic. When I had a small child, I worked at NBC News and I could not miss work. If I had a sick kid, I couldn't do my job from home. And I had to show my face at the 9 a.m. editorial meeting, network meeting every morning. I dropped my daughter off at daycare at 8:15. I ran to the subway. I ran into Rock Center and I found my seat on the banquette in this giant conference room. I got through those years because my lead reporter, Tracy Connor, who now runs the Daily Beast, would lend me her daughter's babysitter when my kid was sick, because her daughter was older and could go to a friend's house. And she'd say, you can have Tasha for the week, right? So it was this constant patchwork of finding care, sitters for my kid, using a babysitting service. I mean, all this crazy stuff that I'm so glad people with young kids at home don't, or however old your kid is, whatever, they don't have that same scramble, because it felt bad and it was so challenging and logistically challenging. And I think there have been some really great strides for everybody, but especially for young parents in the media business, where there was such a premium on showing your face and being here. And, you know, this idea that like you're only working if you're at your desk. It's just not true, right?
It's not true. And I think we are finally entering a world where, you know, I hope that belief becomes universal, but I'm still seeing that cultural conflict. I'll tell you that. And I wonder if you have those same conversations. What we're talking about now, I completely agree with you, right? And I'm sure your team agrees. And I'm sure we all have quite a few leaders we talk to who would agree. Now, on the other side, I do have conversations with CEOs, with editors, mostly in more traditional news organizations and newsrooms, mostly also from more traditional kind of editorial like upbringing, who have such a hard time with that perceived loss of power, that perceived loss of control, that perceived loss of importance. Is that something that you're seeing as well somewhere in your surroundings? Is that what do we tell these people? How do we kind of get them on board? Do we have to get them on board? Or is that just a generational shift in leadership that needs to happen?
It's such an interesting question. I think it also depends on the makeup of your newsroom and the size of your teams and all that kind of stuff. You've brought up control a couple times. It's so interesting. As you know, I do yoga and I'm a yoga teacher. I'm not teaching now, but I'm a trained yoga teacher. And so much of the words that we're talking about apply to the things that you contemplate in a yoga practice, right? It's like control and freedom. And this, you know, I don't want to be all zen about it. I'm not. But I did feel going through the pandemic when I did my yoga teacher training, and it was 2020 was the pandemic. It was George Floyd. I had a very agitated newsroom, that the physical practice of yoga, but also some of the study of it, really helped me formulate a standpoint on these things, which was that there's so many things we can't control. And I'm just not that interested in controlling them. I'm much more interested in absorbing the reality and making a great magazine in reality. Sorry to get all like, you know,
oh no,
thinking about it. I don't know. I mean, anecdotally, Anita, too, what I hear is that it's a lot of men driving the in-person thing. I hate to generalize. I think my generation is better than probably some people older than me. But sometimes it's people don't want to be at home. They want to be at work. They want to hold on to the way work used to define our lives and structure our home lives too, which was like these people are out until this time and then they come home and they have dinner or whatever. And all of it's gone out the window. And I'm not saying it's all great. I think I always had childcare because I had jobs. I had to be in the office. I liked being in the office. I liked having a great babysitter till 7 because I could cram in a beer with someone on my way home, you know, and I did that a lot. And work was really a big part of my social life. And I have a lot of wonderful relationships from those times. Pandemic happened. My daughter was 7, I guess, at the time. Home all the time. I did have help. I did have a babysitter who was able to be with her and help with school in the time that she was remote learning, which I couldn't have done my job at HuffPost otherwise. But once she was back in school, the expectation was that I was going to be here, right? So I now pick her up from school every day. I'm with her, I don't have a babysitter anymore. It's great. I love it. I was ready. But her expectation of me as a parent is very different post-pandemic. And I think, to be honest, it's hard. I have also had moments where I've been like, man, it was easier when I just
totally
went to work every day, right? And I put less, there was a lot, I wasn't shuttling her around and trying to cram it in between meetings. So I think that's also part of why there's this desire to go back to the structure, but I just don't think it's possible.
Yeah.
And it is because people they're growing, they're creating families, they're getting divorced, they're doing whatever in a totally different environment with a different set of expectations that are never going to conform to what they were before. And it is more complicated. And especially as a leader, it does require not getting annoyed, or like, come on, but again, I have sort of let that go, even if that was sort of, it could have been a feeling in the past around certain things. But we're all humans living our lives, doing the best we can. And that has to be part of how we understand work at this point too.
And I think Hillary, you're making so many good points. And I do feel that that this idea of can we just pretend this never happened? Can it just go back to the way it was? I do feel that kind of urge from some folks, specifically, as you said, people who've been in leadership roles for a long time, specifically men, white men, people who kind of come from this world of where power also equals control, right? So I do feel a lot of what we're talking about here also means that suddenly power is something else, right? Because many of the words that you've been using, empathy, feedback, listening, freedom, autonomy, like a lot of these words, if we had, let's, just dial the clock back 30 years, I do not think an editor-in-chief of one of the important media brands would have used those words in an interview.
Oh, I definitely don't think so. I mean, from 2007 to 2010, I worked at the New York Observer for Peter Kaplan, who, he, I guess, wasn't there the last year I was there, but legendary editor, amazing human, like most delightful person in the world, learned so much at the Observer. What a dysfunctional workplace where we all lived to serve Peter. All we wanted was his approval, and it was very motivating. I remember specific feedback he gave me that propelled me, forward into my career, really, really important stuff. Right. But I tell people about these times. It's like, we had to do a cover story every week. On Thursday after we closed the magazine, we closed the paper Tuesday night. Wednesday, everybody was hungover. We'd go in for an edit meeting. Peter was never happy with the paper, ever. Never happy. And then we'd all kind of drag ourselves to the Old Town Bar and eat burgers and drink more beer. And then Thursday, we would be locked in, the senior editors would be locked in his office for however long it took until we had a cover story idea that he liked. And sometimes it was clear. Sometimes it was Elliot Spitzer is screwed, right? Or whatever. Great politics story. But I mean, we would just sit there and just toss out ideas. And I remember so well, one day I was like, at hour 3, I'm obsessed with Carla Bruni. This became a cover story I wrote for the Observer. It was just this ode to Carla Bruni, and which he finally read Monday night at 9:00 and was like, "There's no reporting in here. Call Tony Jute," like preeminent scholar, right, at NYU, and get a quote. I'm like, Tony Jude. He's like, just call him. He'll say something smart, which he did. And it made it like everything was a learning experience, but it was torture. I mean, it was so hard. And it's, that sort of, I would never want to replicate the way we worked there, but I've really tried to think about, and I would never be a leader like Peter, right? I mean, it's like, I'm not a charismatic figure. That's not the kind of leadership that's important to me. But I'm still glad I experienced it. And
Totally.
I think that, and another formative one was when I was at Politico, which was it was just brutal. It was brutal. I learned how to play the game. I made it 9 months. I got a lot of traffic. And then I was like, I am out.
This is not for me.
This is not for me. I am not a 5:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. person doing this work, right?
Yeah.
In this way. But it taught me a lot about what I was capable of and what I refused to do.
Mm.
And what I refused to ask other people to do.
Yeah.
And that, I think, as you get older and accrue more experience, I also wonder if some people who are really wedded to the former structures haven't worked lots of places. Like I have worked in a lot of American media companies and sort of plucked things, good and bad, from each one to help try to get me to a place where, you have your own idea about how to be a leader. But those like terrible experiences were just as important as the best ones. To be honest, I'm still looking for the best one. I'm looking for, I haven't had that. We've talked about this before. There's not somebody I worked for who was my model. It's really been a cobbled together way of being from experiences I've had, if that makes sense. But maybe that's just the way
that's how you do it, right? I think that's how you learn. You learn how, about your authentic leadership by, sometimes mimicking others, sometimes saying, oh, I really do not want to be like this person. Sometimes being inspired by peers or employees or friends or Netflix shows, right? I feel like there is no straight line of like, here are the 10 bullet points. And once you learn them, you're great, right? I mean, obviously, I'm a big believer in management training and leadership training. Otherwise, you and I wouldn't have met in the executive program at CUNY that I built. But I do think that's just a part of the equation, right? That another part is just living through that journey of experiences and reflecting on it and taking what you want and leaving the other things out. So I actually do think what you're saying is exactly the way that it's supposed to be. And ultimately, the question is, do you think you learned more in balance from good or bad leadership that surrounded you?
Bad.
Yeah.
My experience at Politico was really formative and just in the way that the kind of boss I wanted to be. Even now I wake up earlier than anybody. I'm sure there's some other people at Slate who are up at 6:30 in the morning, and I check our traffic. I look at the site. My mood can swing based on how things are looking, right? Because I take our goals really seriously and take the budget seriously. And I'm constantly doing this math in my head about like, how is this looking? But I don't send Slack messages at 6:45 in the morning. It takes some self-control because it would be convenient for me to just be like, blah, 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 blah. But God forbid somebody has their notifications on. It's like nothing. I guess this is the thing, right? What rises to the occasion that it's so important that you need to send that kind of like message that you're at my beck and call kind of thing, right? That's like the antithesis of who I want to be as a leader. It's like it's about trust. And so that's what I felt like, I was in some workplaces where they're just the way that leadership was handled was, as you're talking about, control and incoming all the time. Wasn't just Politico. It was NBC. It was other places too, just incoming. And look, I get it. It's like the Boston bombing happened and I went to the office at 4 a.m, I was there the day. It was when they were catching Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, but like, that was exciting. That's news. Call me when there's news.
Yeah.
Don't literally that's it. That's it. The other stuff, it can usually wait.
It can usually wait.
And I think that's a wise approach, right? That's how they know what's important.
Yeah.
You know what's important? The news, the website, the stories. And yes, all the other stuff we're talking about, but it does require impulse control. I'll be honest, because I get annoyed about things and immediately want to But I have learned, not just from my yoga practice, but from some hard knocks in life, if you wait, it's going to be better.
That's a very smart thing to say. And I think true for many, many things in life. Hillary, we're nearly at the end of our conversation, unbelievably. So maybe as a last question, what would you, if you could talk to young Hillary in the earlier phases of her career, what would you tell her about leadership and management and careers? Any advice you'd share?
Oh, man. Advice for my young self. I would say, don't worry so much about if other people think you're smart. Because I came up through literary stuff and culture. Everyone I worked with went to an Ivy League school. The discourse was at a high level. And I did a lot of faking it, or nodding.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish I had asked more questions because I would have learned things that I think would have been really interesting. But I was too afraid to show that I didn't have the same background. I didn't have the same academic training or education or knowledge. I'm terrible with history. I mean, it's embarrassing. But I would tell myself not to cover up those things and to just be curious, because also it's a great quality as a reporter. And if I had learned a little more about how to be a good reporter earlier on, I think that would have been really valuable information and knowledge, to carry with me up through. But I think don't be afraid to show what you don't know.
That's awesome. Hillary, what a wonderful way to end this wonderful conversation with you. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you, Anita.
This was today's episode of Better Leaders. If you enjoyed it, please do follow us and subscribe. Thanks for listening.
Missing link.